now for something different. Different in 4 ways. First, it's about classical music, not about popular music. If you go by recordings, 1 out of 25 people speaking on classical music is 4 times overrepresented. If you go by live music, we just found out from Bonnie, we're underrepresented, so I'm hoping next time we'll have 40% of the people talking about classical music. Second, I'm not an economist. Don't do quantitative work either. There's some descriptive statistics in here, at least in the project, but most of my work is qualitative. Third, I'm trying to explain something that's quite different than what a lot of people are trying to explain. I'm trying to explain changes in quality of performance, which is a tricky thing to study. And so something different. And fourth, I've got music. So to talk about what's special about explaining Verdi and Wagner voices, for those of you who aren't opera people, the simple story is Verdi and Wagner stand in for the 40% of opera that's performed, among them most of the most popular operas out there, that was written in the late 19th, early 20th century, and this requires a particular type of voice. This voice needs to be, doesn't need to be agile, but it needs to have a wide range, technically very secure, and it needs to have a dark, full, passionate tone, so you can get anguished about, stabbing your wife or your boss or something like that. So to give you an idea what kind of voice this is, I'm going to play a little bit from Aria Celeste Aida by Verdi, sung by Franco Corelli in 1967. I'll play the bridge right now, and then if you stick around till the end, I'll play you the end of the aria. This is about 30 seconds from the middle in the bridge, and you'll notice that he takes a breath and sings for 17 or 18 seconds, which for an opera singer is a very, very long time in the middle. But you'll hear this big, robust, dark voice, I hope. Oops. Yeah. Kind of Mac users, so it's challenging. So the thing I'm trying to explain is pretty simple. This kind of singing is going extinct. You will never, probably live in your lifetime, have the opportunity to hear anybody probably close to the quality of Franco Corelli there, who sang in the 60s. And the question is why? And this is a fascinating social scientific puzzle. Why does this kind of singing, the aficionados call it spinto and dramatic singing, why has it declined over the last 50 years, starting in the 60s and 70s? So these are the big, dark, expressive voices. So to show that it was declining, we chose 2 methods, very hard to measure quality. So we did confidential interviews, they're still ongoing, with opera professionals, people who cast, people who conduct, people who teach, people who write about opera, singers themselves, in all different countries, all different age groups. And we coded the reviews of recordings. And both of them reveal precisely the same thing, namely a striking decline in this kind of singing starting somewhere in the period from 60 to 80. There are little differences between Verdi and Wagner, but it's quite similar. To give you an idea of how striking these results are, so every time I interview somebody, the first question is a completely open-ended question saying, have you noticed any change in Verdi and Wagner singing, the very best Verdi and Wagner singing over the last 50 years? 95% of the people, completely unsolicited, immediately say it's declined, which is so striking that you think there's some methodological issue there, but it's backed up by the recording data as well. So it's pretty clear such a decline exists, or at least is perceived to exist. And we don't think it's spurious. That is to say, we control for most of the things people think might be biases. So the most obvious is that opera singers are hopelessly nostalgic. They are always going on and on about old singers, past time, just as lots of rock people talk about, it's never been the same since the 60s. So everybody who ventures an opinion about Verdi and Wagner, we ask them a bunch of other questions about quality. What do they think about Mozart singing, Baroque singing, Rossini? What do they think about the orchestras that perform in opera houses? What do they think about conductors? No change whatsoever. They don't view any decline. In most cases, they view an increase. So there's something quite striking about this particular area. And it's a bunch of other things we try to correct for, like changing aesthetic perceptions. We use CD reviews published in a relatively short period of time and so on. But it's a pretty consistent result. And this is what makes it, I think, interesting and even tractable to study. It's anomalous. So if you thought all traditional art forms were declining, symphonic music, jazz, piano, ballet, everything, then there would be a million factors that might explain it, not much differentiation, and very hard to figure out. But this is almost entirely anomalous in the art world. It's hard to think of any other type of performance, even within the opera world, as I just alluded to, concert pianists, string quartets, lots of things that are unsexy, unremunerative, but much better than they were 50 years ago. So why Verdi and Wagner seem in decline? And so this is a model social scientific puzzle. It's important because the opera world really depends on these operas that people love. Opera is really an extemporaneous art form, sort of like jazz singing. Experienced opera goers don't go to see Aida. They've seen it 100 times before. They go to see how somebody sings Aida. And if that isn't there in high quality, there's really no point. And this is the kind of opera that includes Puccini, for example, that brings people to the art form. There's wide variation, it's puzzling, and it's totally understudied. Unstudied. There's quite a bit of discussion in newspaper criticism, on the standing room line at the Met, in arts publications, and so on, but nobody's ever done any scholarship on it whatsoever. Just to give you some idea of the type of measurement that we did, so when we looked at recordings, we had people independently code how positive recordings were by year. So we broke down reviews of recordings, published reviews of recordings by singer, by opera, and by year. And so you can generate a graph like this of the perceived quality of the reviews. So this is for the lead role of Tristan and Isolde, Wagner tenor. What you can see is that there's a bunch of people in the 50s and 60s and so on that were quite good, and now you don't see many. And we also thought very seriously about each data point, what was going on. So in fact, the two dots over in the far right are spurious. They're spurious in the following sense, that in opera it is possible to record things that you couldn't possibly sing live, because you really lack the voice for it, but with recording technology you can make people sound good. So in fact, those two dots are two recordings by Placido Domingo, who never sang this role live on stage because he simply doesn't have the voice for it. So if you take those dots out, it's really a striking decline, and you see them pretty much for every type of singing, male, female, high, low, for this Bach, and you don't see it for Mozart, you don't see it for Rossini, you don't see it for anything else. Okay, so we interviewed a lot of people, we read a lot about it, we thought a lot about it, and the conjectures that most people in the opera world hold are almost clearly wrong for explaining why this is. They're aware, as I mentioned, that the problem is there, but they don't have a good explanation why. There's a lot of people who think that pitch is higher than it used to be, which it just isn't. That opera houses are bigger, some are, but the core opera houses in the world are not just the same size, they're the same opera houses as they were 50 years ago. Orchestras may be slightly louder, but not a lot, and not for the orchestration of Verdi, but only for Wagner. And since this applies also to recordings, probably not the explanation. Economic demand, so you're all economists, this is probably what you think of first. We looked at the average wage, the relative wage to the median, and winner-take-all salaries in opera. They're all higher than they were 50 years ago. And what's more, Verdi and Wagner singers are paid more, 2 times more, 2.5 times more than any other kind of singer because the demand is high. So that doesn't seem right. Pedagogy, a lot of people think that teaching methods might be inappropriate somehow. It's hard to give any theoretical account of this that makes sense. Why would it be that people can teach people to sing Baroque opera, teach people to sing Mozart, teach people to play piano, but they suddenly can't teach people to sing Verdi and Wagner? Cultural demand. So the problem with, it's quite possible, as you'll see, that the rise of other art forms plays some role in the causal process that gives rise to this, but it can't be the whole explanation, precisely because this is so anomalous. So what's striking about the world today is we're very wealthy, we're very diverse. People can find pockets of excellence in almost everything against the trend of culture. So we have thousands and thousands of kids who can play all the major piano concertos at the age of 13, even though that's an unfashionable thing to do. We live in the golden age of string quartets, even though that's a dull thing that old people go see. Opera is actually, relatively speaking, a younger audience and a more vibrant multimedia art form, so it's unclear what's going on. And finally, there's some arguments about career management, that people are doing things too young and so on, that when we looked at them closely turn out to be wrong. So we thought about this more sociologically, thinking about producing opera singers the way you think about producing athletes. That it's a social commitment, and that what determines how many people actually get to the top and excel at something is a life cycle of social mechanisms that push them in that direction. And we think that those social mechanisms are atrophying just for this particular, or especially for this particular kind of performance. So the 3 factors are, first, take it in a life cycle. You have to identify who's talented. These voices are exceptionally rare. They may be more rare than any other kind of artistic talent. There have been at any given time, even when the world was pretty much primed to find opera singers, only a couple of people who actually could sing these roles as written, the way Corelli did, and get it all right, and were considered, historically the top people. Fewer and fewer people nowadays ever sing without a mic, and let alone sing classical music. And the result of that is that you don't know the basic thing that you would need just to create a pool of people from whom you might someday find the great singers. You don't know who can sing loud, and you don't know who can sing on pitch. Compare that to basketball playing. Why is the NBA so much better than it was when some of us were kids, certainly when I was a kid? There are lots of reasons, but one reason is if you're tall as I am or taller, anywhere in the world today, they will put a basketball into your hands and make you play basketball until they find out you cannot make it to the NBA, right? You're exploiting a tremendous amount of human capital. We used to do that in the West with churches, which was almost universal, with towns that sang together. Everybody knew who could sing loudly and on pitch. That's no longer true. Secondly, even if you identify the people, you have to keep them in the game. So this is interesting and very distinctive to this kind of artistic performance. Almost everything that people do artistically, you know by the time they're 16 or maybe 12, whether or not they have a shot at being world class. Same with athletics. The odd thing about this dark, spinto and dramatic singing is that it blooms very late. People usually achieve greatness between the age of 30 or 40, and they don't know beforehand whether they're going to be great. They might be an okay singer of various kinds, but every singer like this has trouble getting this big, hefty voice into place, and it doesn't fall into place. The most famous Wagnerian soprano of the 20th century, Kirsten Flagstad, was a pretty mediocre provincial singer who sang in Norway and did one gig once in Sweden until she was 38 years old, then emerged, became the greatest singer anybody's ever heard recorded, singing Wagner, sang at the Mad and Bayreuth and everywhere else. So this is quite typical. And as societies get more wealthier, the cost of waiting rises. The opportunity cost of waiting rises. We're more diverse. That's why probably all of us who study the music industry know lots of people in New York City or in LA who used to be remarkably successful singers or something else, and now are in arts administration or in law school or something like that. Finally, even if you keep them in the game and you've identified them, you have to cast them. I think this is the least important of the three factors, but it does matter. Spin or dramatic singers are heftier, big voices come out of big bodies. And opera has gotten, like many other things in our society, much more visually oriented. So it's more difficult to cast these people. I was a little skeptical about this explanation because there are no shortage of hefty people on the stage of the Met. But when I interviewed people at conservatories, I found they were selecting people on the basis of weight at the age of 18, even at the top conservatories in the United States. So there may be something to this. Okay, so let me give you a couple of case studies to talk about how this works. Take Italy. So we think of Italy as the place that produces opera singers, but not anymore. It's fallen off the map completely since the days of Caruso and Pavarotti. What's happened? Okay, well, first of all, you have to identify talent, but the Catholic Church, which was a traditional place that identified talent and trained people young, is no longer doing that. Vatican II means you sing pop songs rather than singing classical stuff in church, and only 17% of Italian youth go to church at all, most of them in very rural areas where they're unlikely to become an opera singer, and going to church often, and that 17% means once a month, not every week. You have to keep singers in the game. It used to be for people like Caruso and Pavarotti that they had all kinds of opportunities to do crossover work. It was true also for the great generation of Jewish singers in the United States who sang in the Borscht Belt in the 40s and 50s, in Broadway and so on. That's also largely disappeared because the difference between microphonic singing and classical singing has gotten so great. And finally, you've got to cast them. Pavarotti and Caruso was homely and Pavarotti was heavy, but they got cast because they did theater performances, but most of it was on LP or audio sound, not HD up close, and so they were much more reliable. Another puzzle, why is the US an opera singer exporting country? You wouldn't think that given our culture, but we have institutions to identify talent. Churches, we're a very religious society, lots of people go to church. Musical theater in school, it's amazing how many people come from MT, go to opera. And we have music in the schools, which a surprising number of other societies don't. We keep singers in the game, and this is tremendously important because we have an enormous, very sophisticated university establishment. If I interview singers in New York who are young singers coming up, the modal story is, I was a Christian kid, I grew up, I sang in church, I sang some MT, I went to the university, I thought maybe I wanted to be a music teacher or else study something else. Somebody heard the voice and said, you could sing opera. And I said, I've never heard an opera. They said, well, go hear an opera. They didn't really like it. And but somebody said to them, you could get a fellowship to get a master's. And they learned to like it, made a career. We are less influenced by postmodern stage direction and more modern traditional sets. Very interesting case, which I'm not going to talk about for time reasons, is South Korea. But the short story with South Korea is this is a country that is 1/3 Methodist with an unbelievable infrastructure of music training, particularly singing training in the churches. 1/3 of Koreans are Christian, but 100% of all those Koreans in American, German, and Italian music schools, where they are very numerous, are Christian. So you really see how these sociological mechanisms of channeling people in creates excellence. That brings us to the end. We can hear the end of Franco Corelli. So this is the end of Celeste Aida, the aria you heard the middle of before. He's going to sing about twice as much as is written there on the music. That clicks in about halfway through. Un trono vicino al sol is a throne close to the sun. Now, this is almost unsingable. This is an example of why this music is so difficult. You'll see that it's soft, and then there's this, it's high, goes up to a high note, and then it has a word, morendo. Morendo in Italian means dying. So what you're supposed to do is go up to this high note on a long breath, and then diminuendo down to a tiny sound. I can count on one hand and one finger the number of singers who have ever successfully recorded this that way, and none of them have the kind of big, robust voice that Corelli does. Most of them cheat. They're little guys who couldn't sing it in the theater, but they can record it. But they sound sort of like Mickey Mouse doing it. Corelli sounds like the Egyptian hero that he's supposed to be. And so if you're not convinced that this is important, ultimately the justification is, this is beautiful, and we'll never hear it again. There we go. Yes?
Again, two questions for you. The first, you showed the scatter diagram, the various of the reviews, and the two kind of recent outliers.
Yeah.
Did you just have to put a line to it? And, I guess two questions. First of all, how did you rate the review?
Right.
Secondly, it wasn't necessarily downward sloping to my eye.
So we didn't fit a line to it because what I'm explaining is not the average. I think actually the average has gone up. That we're generally able to train people on the average better. We do almost everything better. And so you can get somebody, singers sing now linguistically much more competently, all this kind of stuff. What we don't have is excellence, which is also a reason.
Sorry to interrupt you. You could put a line in the 90th percentile.
Right. Okay. I'm up for trying to do that. And we had people rate the quality of, so we had these little anonymized segments of a review. This is the 2 sentences that discuss the tenor's performance, and they had 100 of them, and they rated the quality.
The second comment I have a question. The idea of keeping the data sort of for you is interesting. And people often never forget the data, but as a labor economist, what it suggests is the age earnings profile should look different.
Mm-hmm.
Should stand out more as I would say workers. That's the thing, get to that point where you get more dispersion among them. So this is kind of a...
Well, so people they tend not to sing these roles before that age. So what they do, there's a certain subset of people who can sing other roles competently and move up. The majority of people, but usually very mediocrely, or not at all. And there's bizarre stories. I mean, people who, there's a guy who sang recently Wagner roles at the Met who actually did manage to move into MT, and he was in the touring Phantom of the Opera for 10 years, and then at the age of 43, some kid from West Texas just went back and sang for the Met, and I said, where have you been? So it's a very strange market that way. Yeah?
In general, older music sells less well than newer music. I wonder in classical music if that's also true, and moreover, if it's true that only the 1967 recording is good, does it sell more conditional on its age than the newer recording of the same opera? And then you could do that and compare it with the genres where there hasn't been decline in quality. You get some evidence, not just that it's true, but also that it matters from the standpoint of not delivering something that consumers want.
I thought a little bit about that. Tricky thing is this, that the favorite media has really changed. So we've moved from CDs to DVDs, which is part of this whole visualization of opera. And so now when you see reviews, it's like, this is the best one to look at, this is the best one to listen to, and so on. So it's pretty messy data, but conceivably, yeah.